Thank you, Cora and Vic and Fred. I have known at least 2 people who have survived airplane crashes. One was a passenger on a commercial flight. As his plane came in to land, something went wrong and hit the runway very hard, skidded sideways, veered off into the grass. Very scary. Some were injured, but no one died. Still, it was just terrifying. And the man I knew who was a passenger on that flight, he never flew again. So the other person was a skilled pilot of small airplanes, and one day, just after takeoff, something malfunctioned. He turned back to make an emergency landing, and in all the confusion, he forgot to lower his landing gear. Oh, no. Had a full tank of gas, the plane skidded on the runway, sparks flying. Somehow the plane did not explode, but it was totaled. And that incident really terrified his family, and he frightened himself that he would not have the wherewithal to put his wheels back down. But he said to me, that kind of thing happens. It's super scary, but I will never forget it. But what am I supposed to do? Stop flying? So the very next week, he went out and bought another airplane, and he flew again. And I flew with him because I thought, well, at least he's not going to forget again to put those landing fields down. So very similar kinds of trauma, but very different responses. And I've wondered, what was it about those guys that gave them such dramatically different perspectives on a similar traumatic event? Now, sure, one was a pilot, one was a passenger, but the real difference wasn't quite what happened. It was in how they processed it and how they responded to it. Well, we all go through traumatic moments: loss, illness, failure, grief, regret. And trauma, when it happens, does not ask for permission first. And it quite often doesn't make any sense at all. But I still wonder about how we wrestle with trauma, because at any number of points in our lives, we're going to face it. It's not like we have the option to skip it. And when something happens that upsets our life, a financial catastrophe, scary medical diagnosis, the death of a loved one, or a bad mistake that we have made, it leaves a mark, something that we carry around with us. It can often paralyze us, keep us from moving forward, or we can just carry it around silently like a heavy load. Or we could acknowledge that it happened, do our best to work through it, and move forward in spite of it. That's a lot easier said than done. No matter how we respond, trauma always changes us, though, and the strange and hopeful thing is it can even transform us in a positive way. So, along those lines, the story that I keep coming back to is this tale of Jacob wrestling with a mysterious stranger in the dark of night. This is a weird story. First of all, we're not even told who Jacob's wrestling. Is it a man? Is it an angel? Is it God? Jacob apparently walks away thinking, well, maybe it was God, or at least someone bearing God's presence or appearance. It's ambiguous, it's shadowy, and it's very intense, often a lot like how trauma feels. We don't know how this wrestling started. We don't know this stranger's name, but they go at it all night. And Jacob holds on. And I think that's a big clue to pay attention to. I think that's what this story wants to show us. Jacob is holding more than a human. He's wrestling with his own past, with his fear, with his shame, with what he's done to his big brother Esau and who he has been in his life. Years before, Jacob had cheated Esau out of Esau's birthright. And in those days, a birthright was a huge thing. It was everything, really. That one episode of Jacob lying, cheating, and stealing had haunted Jacob ever since. He had been hiding from Esau for years. He had to. What he had done to his big brother was unforgivable, and Jacob knew it. But now, his day of reckoning was coming. Now, there was no avoiding Esau, and for all Jacob knew, Esau was planning to kill Jacob and his whole family. That was the trauma Jacob was living through. How he had made a major mess up in his life, and how it was all now coming back to bite him, to wrestle with him, quite literally. This story is an accurate portrayal, I think, of how we feel when something traumatic occurs. We want details about who this mysterious guy is, where he came from, and who lands the first punch. When something traumatic happens to us, we want that kind of clarity. We want to know the reason why it's even happening in the first place. We would love someone or something to blame, even if it's ourselves, or we might want a scapegoat. But so many times there are no logical and easy answers, and it's frustrating. It upsets our sense of justice, of right and wrong. That's how trauma feels. We're confronted by emotions we cannot really see or name. We have fears for the future that we can't quite describe. We can be completely in the dark. At the same time, the story of Jacob wrestling is telling us that even in our suffering, even in the shadows of our emotional pain, God is right there with us. If Jacob was right and this mystery person was God, then we're being told that God is with us in the darkness of our emotional struggle. That as we wrestle, God wrestles too. As we hurt, God hurts with us. Our struggle is God's struggle. So I think a crucial thing this story has to say to us is that even through the most crazy and painful experiences in life, we can still be transformed and find hope for the future. Now, I'm not suggesting that God makes something good out of every suffering, or even worse, that God brings us suffering to help us grow as human beings. I wouldn't want to worship that kind of God. What I am saying is that suffering is an unfortunate fact of life. It just is. And that's not just a basic understanding of Christianity and Judaism. If you've ever studied Buddhism, you know the first 3 of the 4 Noble Truths are all about acknowledging suffering. But our suffering and our trauma, as dark as they are, they don't have to lead to hopelessness. It's in the response to suffering that we can find meaning. It's in the response to suffering that we can find hope. And that maybe we can even find a new identity. You know, in the Bible, a name is always more than just a name. It tells us about the character of a person, their true identity. The name Jacob literally means cheater. And that fits because that's who he was. And in the story of Jacob's struggle, he's given an entirely new name. And with a new name, he's given new hope. The stranger tells him, "You'll no longer be called Jacob, but Israel," a name that means you have wrestled with God and with humans and you've prevailed. In other words, if you can get through this, you can get through anything. After a long night of wrestling, after he's wounded and he's changed, he's no longer Jacob, he's Israel. Something within him has shifted. He's been through the fire and he's come out limping, but alive, transformed. And boy, do I get that. You know, for all of us who've experienced major trauma in our lives, we can testify to the fact that we are not the same person now as we were before. We've all been transformed and changed through our sufferings and challenges. The promise in this story is that if we honestly wrestle with God in the midst of that suffering, if we really don't hold anything back, we can find new meaning and purpose. That's why it's perfectly understandable and it's okay to be angry with God, to shake your fist at God, to be furious at the injustice you've suffered, the pain that you're enduring, to even doubt the existence of God. God can handle that. But hold on and do not let go. Fight, wrestle all night long. That's not being unfaithful. It may be the most faithful thing you'll ever do, to be honest about who you are and who you are becoming because of the trauma that you've experienced. Because if trauma is a reality that we all face, and we do, we can understand it as a process that we can work through alongside God. Of course, Jacob walks away from this whole experience with a permanent limp. What's that all about? I think it acknowledges that any trauma we go through leaves a mark. Our inner change is reflected in an outward sign of that change. So Jacob's limp becomes part of him, just as the injuries we receive as a result of our traumas become part of us. We can't wipe them away. But here's the really important part. Even though Jacob wears the experience of his trauma in a very visible way, he doesn't let it define who he is. He's not defined by his limp. He's defined by his new name, Israel. He's not who he was before, and neither are we. There was a man in a church I served who was a rancher. He was one of the most kindest, gentlest, happiest people I have ever known. And like Jacob, this man walked with a pronounced limp. So one day I went out to his place to spend some time with him, and we walked around the perimeter of his property, inspecting his fences. And we had a long time to talk that day. And eventually I asked him about his limp, and he told me a story I will never forget. He grew up during the Great Depression. When he was 6 years old, his father disappeared, just left. His mother could not support all 4 of her children, so she arranged for each of them to live with different families. You imagine? That's rough, but he said that kind of thing was not uncommon in those days. He ended up with strangers, complete strangers in another town. Never saw his mother or siblings very much after that, and the people who took him in became his surrogate parents. He told me, when that first happened, I cried myself to sleep every night. I used to dream that my mother would come and get me, but she never did. He said it plainly to me, but his eyes told the deeper story. That pain was still there. Then he took a deep breath and he said, but that's life. If that had not happened, I would have never ended up in the town that I grew up in, never would have met my wife. It all worked out eventually. Eventually, I said. He said, well, when I was a teenager, I was angry all the time. I don't know why. Got into a lot of trouble. One night, I got drunk, stole a car, wrecked it out on a country road, broke my leg bad, laid in a ditch all night before I was discovered the next day. He said, my broken femur was never set correctly, and that was my turning point. I haven't stolen anything since. And he patted his thigh and he said, this leg, it reminds me of what anger and pain can do if you let them take over. So that limp was part of him, but it did not define him. His trauma marked him, but it didn't make him. What made him was how he responded, how he chose to move forward, even with a limp. What made him was the grace that he carried with him through all of that. We may limp through life. Most of us do, one way or another. Some of us carry very deep wounds, physical, emotional, spiritual. Some of those wounds are visible, others are not. But like Jacob and like that rancher, Our trauma is not the end of our story. We're not defined by our limp. We are defined by a God who wrestles with us in the dark. We're defined by a love that never lets us go. We're defined by how we rise from the struggle, transfer with us